Hi, everybody, and welcome back to OMN Insights. My name is Surati Kadir, and I'm your host. And before we get into today's discussion, we have a small announcement to play.
Tsedale Bridge Reality Garee Samu'eel Birhaanut manni jireenya ala namaaf ni barbaachisa. Inni kun garuu jireenya tulbuu horee yaada namaa boqochiisa, gaaddisa aara galfii ta'ee jiraachuuf nama sassachiisa. Maarree isinis kan akkanaa bitachuu yoo feetan akkasumas kan ofii qabdan gurgurtanii bu'a qabeessa ta'uun gara xiqqaatti yookaan gara guddaatti jijjiirrachuu yoo barbaaddan dafaa mariisisaa. Bridge Reality Tora bilbila keenya torba ja'a sadii torba afur saddeet sadii ja'a lamarratti nuuf bilbila. Bridge Reality Garee Samu'eel Birhaanuti.
Today, we are going to be continuing our discussion on the peace talks between the Oromo Liberation Army and the Ethiopian government that began towards the end of April and went into May. And we will also be discussing the recent constitutional reform research that was published and has been quite a point of discussion in Ethiopia and the communities, political communities and social communities that surround it. And to have this conversation, we have the honor of being joined by founder and former editor-in-chief of Addis Standard, Tsedale Lemma. Welcome, Tsedale.
Thanks for having me, sorry.
Most welcome. So according to Addis Standard, on the 16th of May, a government-funded policy think tank, Policy Studies Institute, or PSI, released a research paper titled FDRE Constitution After 3 Decades, inquiring into whether and what to amend. The 374 paper has been criticized by a caucus of oppositional parties, including the Oromo Federalist Congress, Oromo Liberation Front, and the Ogaden National Liberation Front. The caucus has called the paper highly disturbing, criticizing its methodology and stating that it is, quote, unfortunate that such a lopsided paper is presented to the public at this critical juncture of our country's history, where the bloodiest war just ended and we are still in the midst of war in much of Oromia, end quote. The study, which claims to have been done over 2 years, included 1,123 survey respondents, 25% of which were in favor of the Constitution being changed, with a particular focus on the structures and contents of the Constitution that mandates multinationalism and the right to self-determination for the nation within the nation. Tsedale, what do you think the implications of the timing of this study are, the findings being released now? And what do you make of the opposition party caucus's assertion that this research being presented now is untimely and could further propel the country into chaos, as it stated in its statement?
Thank you, Surati. To begin with my own personal reflection about the announcement of that, I was caught off guard, honestly, because it seems nobody heard about this 2 years study or research that the organizers claimed to have done. So it was quite a surprise. The second point is the way it was presented by the state media. It was presented as a definite and final way of beginning to reform or amend, whichever way was framed, the Constitution. It was like the end of the beginning, like the beginning of the end of reforming the Constitution. So it was quite a surprise. And, you know, constitutional reforms, the Constitution itself has when and how constitutional reforms or amendments can be done. And so given that this has caught a lot of people by surprise, you know, the first thing I did was contact a few opposition party leaders just for my own knowledge, and none of them said they have heard about it. And so that was quite a surprising way of announcing it. Moving to the reaction from the opposition, I think it is quite justified what they said there in terms of its content, in terms of its methodology, also in terms of its timing. It was, I think it was justified. The concerns they raised is quite justified, particularly its timing at this point in time, as they have said, where the country is trying to move out of one brutal violence on Tigray, and in Oromia, it's still happening. So floating the idea of constitutional reform or amendment, whatever they wanted to do with it at this point in time, is quite agitating. And it adds up to this very tense and polarized political environment that the country is experiencing for the last 5 years.
What do you think the implications of this, Tsedale, will be on sustaining the arrangement, political arrangement that the Ethiopian government has struck up with the TPLF in terms of this interim admin, and then also as the OLA, the Oromo Liberation Army, and the Ethiopian government are still in the process of working out, whether or what the next round of peace talks will look like. This infrastructure, this political infrastructure the Constitution provides for multinationalism, self-determination, being, quite targeted in this study. And I mean, are there implications on these peace processes, both of them in their different stages, given that this is what the state is promoting at this point through publishing the findings of this study?
The implications are quite serious. I wish the organizers didn't present it as if like this was a dead end. This was something that was definitely need to happen now. The implications is that the government in its cessation of hostilities agreement with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, had used the Constitution as a benchmark to deliver on the arguments that they both have signed. It's stipulated in the agreement that the implementation of the agreement is to be done according to the Constitution. This is one. In the first round of talks with the Oromo Liberation Army in Zanzibar, the government also said, and they were very loud about it, and that these talks were going to happen. If they're going to happen, they will be bound by the Constitution. So floating the idea of constitutional reform or amendment, we don't know what they wanted to do with it anyway. At this time, when the government is invoking the very Constitution to bound itself based on the frameworks of the Constitution to sign a peace agreement with these two actors, it just absolutely defeats the purpose of the very purpose that the government used the Constitution to rely on delivering on this peace process with the Tigrayan authorities and the ongoing talks with the Oromo Liberation Army. So that means like we don't have a framework, a benchmark. If you are touching the Constitution at this point in time, what is the benchmark that the government is going to use to enter into an internationally brokered agreement with political parties? So it's absolutely ill timing, and the implication is that it agitates the process, this fledgling process. It's fragile as it is, both of it. It simply adds up to, agitates the entire process.
Thank you, Tsedale. In the week of the 23rd of April and until about the 3rd of May, we saw the commencement and the conclusion of the first round of negotiations between the Oromo Liberation Army and the Ethiopian government. The talks concluded with both parties affirming that there was interest and willingness to continue engaging each other, but that there were outstanding differences on key political matters that saw these first round of talks conclude without any kind of political settlement. Now, on the 17th of May, the OLA issued a press release stating that, and quote, Arat Kilo initiated a broad offensive across territories in Oromia under our administration. This move starkly contradicts the understanding that de-escalation should be prioritized during negotiation processes, and quote, it continues to state that this military offensive has led to the army to defend territories in, quote, in West Walaga, East Walaga, Horoguduru, Bashawa, Ishawa, Arsi, Hararge, Borana, and Guji, end quote, and that it finds the toll on civilians to be, quote, deeply concerning. How do you think these recent military activities will impact the second round of negotiations between the parties, or will this mean that a second round of negotiations is no longer a prospect? How do you view these military activities in the context of further talks?
Yes, both in the context of advancing the talks to the second round and in the context of the suffering of civilians, this is bad news. The renewed conflict that we are witnessing the last 2 weeks is absolutely bad news. In the context of advancing the talks that to the second round, we had some glimmer of hope from the first round of talks for two reasons. Number one, that the two have recognized each other to sit in the same room and to start discussing. They have also recognized that the militarized violence is probably not the way forward to advance the interests of the Oromo. And that is a big step. It was a big leap forward in my understanding. And also the announcement when they concluded the first round talks that both have said that the talks happened in a very positive atmosphere, adds up to the hopes that the two have begun to build trust. Now, trust is the very key thing if they wanted to advance the talks to the second round. So in the context of advancing the talks to the second round, the renewed fighting brings bad news. It should not have happened. But it implicates that the first round of talks collapsed, literally, even though it was a friendly one and both have remarked about it positively, which is a very good thing. It didn't secure the very bare minimum, which is a ceasefire. So the renewed attack implicates that the failures of the first round of talks in achieving key and critical aspect of the entire process. Yes, the two have differences, fundamental differences, and nobody expects that to be addressed, of course, in just one round of talks. This has to be a result of a sustained negotiation, talks. After the talks, they have to go into dialogue, and then after that, into negotiations and compromise and all these things. But given all the positive vibes that we have seen in the first round, the second round dampens what happened in the first round. Also adds up to the suffering of civilians. We have seen one of the most daunting and atrocious suffering of civilians in the Oromia region for the last 5 years. And it's enough, it would have been better if the two called it off and have signed at least a temporary cessation of hostilities that will allow them to build more trust. So the second round of talks could have been more productive. So I am deeply concerned now into the implication of both the civilians' life and its impact on the second round, which are not conclusively announced as of yet, if whether or not second round is going to happen. So it adds up into regressing the process back.
Thank you, Tsedale. Question on this, what it will take for this cessation of hostilities to take place, even in an interim, as second, third, or however many rounds of talks continue. Do you think that the Ethiopian government has the potential to accept that for a cessation of hostilities to take place, the OLA will have to keep some of the territories that it's taking control of as those negotiations are underway and there are decisions made about political administration around Oromia, how that will take place, what transitional process will be there? Or is the OLA, because it is not the state military force, expected to retract completely for that cessation of hostilities to take place? Do you have any thoughts around this?
Well, it's very difficult to frame an idea around this. First of all, to keep the OLA keep the territories under its control today, it should be a matter of negotiation. It should be a matter of compromise, and that should come at a later stage. It's important to really properly prioritize or cascade events that should happen in the first round of talks, and then if they are convening the second round of talks, the first priority should really be cessation of hostilities, unconditional cessation of hostilities from both sides, because civilians are suffering, not only because of the militarized violence, but also the drought and the flooding today. Aid agencies are not able to reach to civilians in many parts of Oromia. And so for that sake, in the interest of the people of Oromo in that region, both of them should really, tune down their own expectations and focus on the first cascade of events, which is cessation of hostilities. What is it now, whether the OLA should be allowed to retain the territories that are under its control today, is a matter of further negotiation and compromise and a serious deal to have been done. And so we don't know what the demands from the both sides are today, but we know what the demand from the Oromo people, at least the immediate demand, is an end to the violence. Now, it should have happened years ago. we want the end of the violence to happen now, so that aid agencies could reach out to the most affected and vulnerable parts of the Oromo people in the regional state. So both of them should really properly cascade the priorities and put front and center the interest of the Oromo people, which is to see the shooting to end today. So I think they should be focusing on that one.
Thank you so much, Tsedale. Coming towards the conclusion of our discussion, after the fall of the EPRDF reign in 2018, this taking place after years of consistent grassroots political struggle in Oromia and then in other regions of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed took office with the expectation that he would lead the country towards free and fair elections. Now, since then, the region and the world have gone from excited, hopeful, even if skeptical in the same breath, to watching Ethiopia become consumed by a number of parallel conflicts and accompanying social ills, including, as you have mentioned in your previous response, famine, also large-scale internal and external displacement. In your view, were we or were people missing something in the flurry of these political events in 2018? Were the signs of what we are now experiencing evident then?
Yes, what a lot of people, including myself, missed. First of all, it was unthinkable that this opportunity could be wasted so much at that time. Given the background of the prime minister and how he came to power, he came on the back of protesters in Oromia and also in Amhara and in Konso, protesters who have just simply demanded respect for the constitution. So you would imagine at that time that nothing could go wrong, and he was handed over power on a silver platter. It is so unimaginable to think that such an opportunity could have been wasted. So yes, it was easy to have been lost in the flurry of excitement at that moment. But a lot of us also have missed the first signs, the writing on the wall from the day the prime minister had his inaugural speech in the national parliament. Many of us also have, missed that opportunity to read what exactly he was saying, and he was telling, things like resuscitating the greatness of Ethiopia should have really alerted many. A few have, kudos to them, have been alerted already. Should have alerted the mass, a good number of mass, that the trajectory, the train was losing the track from that moment onwards, because there was really no glorious past to have been resuscitated. And so, yes, we have missed quite a lot of writing on the wall. And it's an absolute tragedy that such an opportunity of a peaceful transition of power could have been wasted in the Ethiopian context, because it was the first. It was the first for something like that to have happened without so much bloodshed and violence. And so it's regrettable and tragic in its own.
A lot of people describe this moment in Ethiopia's political juncture, including actually in the statement that the oppositional party caucus made in response to the announcement of the findings of that constitutional study, naming this juncture as extremely significant, as historic, as extremely urgent. Beyond, because the urgency of peace talks and settling political settlements coming about to see hostilities end where there is active war is absolutely a priority. But beyond that, what do you think is necessary for Ethiopia to ensure that moving forward, it heals from whatever traumatic past or historic wounds are fueling these conflicts, and to ensure that its social fabric is stronger moving forward? What would you advise, whether it's civil society, whether it's government, whether it's people at grassroots community levels doing organizing work? What conversations take priority now and in the next year or two for you?
Well, I think, look, Ethiopia has gone through several phases of shaping the nature and identity of the state and the relationship of the Ethiopian people with the state. The last reconfiguration of the Ethiopian state happened in 1991. And there has been, an intense discussion and happening across the society between 1991 and 94, before the current constitution was adopted in 1995. And that has, given some kind of leeway for shaping the identity of the state. What is at stake today is that, because it has unceremoniously been collapsed the last 5 years. The attack, the relentless attack on the multinational constitution has agitated Ethiopians across the country. And, you know, this attack that involves artists and poets and, you know, poetesses and eventually culminating into a drone attack is an attack on the multinational federalism and constitution that the state relies on for its identity and for its shape and how it governs its relationship with the Ethiopian community. So what needs to happen today is the recognition that we need a new social contract, because what took us for 27 years between 1991 until the prime minister came to power has collapsed unceremoniously and through wars of genocide. And so that recognition must happen now. And we must embark into the conversation of what do we want? What kind of state is going to, what kind of social contract that do we need to shape? And that involves a genuine and serious and inclusive conversation to happen beginning today, and an immediate end in attacking that social contract. The constitution we have is somehow a social contract that Ethiopians signed at that moment. Has it been debatable? Yes, it has been debatable. Should it be discarded so unceremoniously and through wars of genocide? No. You know, so the first thing that to happen is restore constitutionalism in that country and allow the stage for an inclusive conversation to happen, that Ethiopians determine the kind of state they want with enough representation. You cannot have a national dialogue, for example, one of the initiatives by the government, while part of the country is engulfed in a civil war. You can't have that one. End those conflicts, militarized violence, ASAP, and embark in this all-inclusive dialogue with all the stakeholders, including religious leaders, civil society, women group, political opposition, political parties, everybody, inclusive dialogue to discuss, close the door and discuss, what do we want? What kind of state do we want? What kind of social contract do we need to shape out so that we can coexist, protecting our diversity and coexist as a unified polity? That's what needs to happen. And I don't see the political dispensation that is today is privy to this kind of arrangement. And this is, I think, what the fault line is currently.
Tsedale, that is a powerful note to end this wonderful conversation on. Thank you so much for your time today. I deeply appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Soroti. Pleasure.
Well, everybody, thank you so much for watching OMN Insight for another week. We were joined by founder and former editor-in-chief of Addis Standard, Tsedale Lemma. Found that conversation insightful and quite powerful as well. My name is Soroti Kadir. I'm your host, and I look forward to joining you again next week.